Soviet Union under Bagirov's Azerbaijani SSR. However, for now, both puppet republics remain very much like the communist states of Eastern Europe. On January 22nd, the Kurds adopted a constitution, and most of the world, although not the Kurds themselves, began referring to it as the Republic of Mahabad. On January 30th, the United Nations Security Council issued its first warning on the issue, advising the Soviets to resolve their differences with Iran and make sure the puppet states were out of existence by March 2nd. As the deadline approached, the British had nearly withdrawn their entire force, while the Soviets had actually added more troops and now had sent weapons shipments to Tabriz to bolster the state of Jafar Peshawari against the Shah. In fact, the Soviets had sent over 11,000 rifles, 1,000 pistols, and various other assorted weapons, including thousands of grenades, to the Azeri separatists in Tabriz. Some munitions also made their way to Mahabad. And of course, the biggest factor was that the Red Army was still occupying the area. In fact, it hadn't evacuated from any part of northern Iran, including Tehran. As the March 2nd deadline hit, the British were finally out. Meanwhile, the Soviet troops remained through their entire sector, and the weapons continued pouring across the Soviet border to Tabriz. The Soviets clearly had never intended to abide by the original agreement, and now they were in an advantageous position along the Caspian, with the former British client in Iran neutralized by not only Red Army troops, but also losing a significant portion of its territory. By the end of the war, America had essentially taken over and assumed Britain's dominant position as the most powerful non-communist allied power. Now, with the communists causing predictable trouble, it wouldn't be the British making a big fuss, but the Americans, for the first time since the wartime alliance, loudly protesting the Soviet actions, with the Americans also assuming the British position as the main manipulator of the Shah's government. That essentially made the two factions here opposing sides in the rapidly developing Cold War between America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, with the American and British client, Iran, being pressed by Soviet clients in Tabriz and Mahabad. However, despite the Americans' possession of the A-bomb and the Soviets not having it yet, the Soviet troops in control of the northern part of the country made launching any type of proxy war or attack impossible. Thus, this conflict played out like many in the Cold War during its later nuclear stage, through the media and in words. The same day, Ahmad Kavam, the Prime Minister of Iran, flew to Moscow. Kavam flew to meet directly with Stalin and Molotov, as he hoped to get directly to the heart of the issue by bypassing the Tabriz and Mahabad authorities that the Soviets had directed them to talk to. With the plane already in the air, the Soviets couldn't say no to the meeting, and always wanting to send the signal that they were doing the right thing, agreed to evacuate their garrisons in northeastern Iran. The Soviets also understood that the British and the Americans would not allow for the continued existence of this situation, and as such they began softening up Peshawari for the inevitable betrayal. Bagirov, the head of the Azerbaijani SSR within the Soviet Union, came to Tabriz to inform Peshawari that the Soviets couldn't guarantee military support forever. However, at this point, the Soviets were holding out hope that the Azeris might be able to hold off the Iranians on their own, even without the Red Army's presence. During his trip, Bagirov took stock of the Azeri garrisons and reported to Stalin that he doubted their ability to hold off the Shah's forces. On the 18th, Iranian Prime Minister Kavam lodged a formal complaint with the United Nations Security Council, who then agreed to further discuss the issue, Soviet Union notwithstanding. The Soviet Union continued to push the limits of the United Nations policy, while as a member of the Security Council, still tried to appear to be acting in good faith. Thus, on the 24th, they withdrew their troops from Tehran and from northeastern Iran, while still maintaining the occupation of the northwest. In addition to their satellite states, the Soviets also had troops stationed in Rasht, along with other areas of the northwest that contained more minorities and less Persians. However, on the 26th, the Soviets informed Kavam that they intended to pull out completely. At the same time, the troops were still there, and the United Nations Security Council was discussing the issue. On the 27th, America referred to Soviet foreign policy in the region as imperialistic, and essentially claimed that the Soviet Union's anti-imperialist posturing was a lie. After this, Soviet diplomat Andrei Gromyko, with Stalin's blessing, walked out of the meeting. This was essentially a protest against two issues. One, the Soviets pointed out that the Americans and British were being imperialistic by manipulating the Shah's government to meddle in the situation, and they also took offense to the labeling of Soviet foreign policy as imperialistic. The walkout was the first moment of doubt in the new United Nations effectiveness. The next day, Bagirov had another meeting with Pishavari in Tabriz, again advising him that the status quo was unsustainable, because for the Soviet Union to legitimize their anti-imperialist claims, they would not be able to keep troops in territory claimed by the Shah. From this perspective, it appeared that Britain and America had the Soviets boxed in, with little to no confidence in the ability of either republic to stand on its own and hold off Iranian forces. The Soviets shifted to a strategy in which they hoped the rebels would come to a deal to reincorporate themselves into Iran and thereby exert Soviet influence within the Iranian government. Moscow now viewed this as the best case outcome. The Soviet backing of the separatists pushed the Shah's government unintentionally further into British and American hands. So the idea was now to use the former rebels to push the Shah's government back in a pro-Soviet direction. On April 4th, resolution number 3 was passed by the United Nations Security Council, this time gently requesting that the Soviets remove their troops. The Soviets again showed public belligerence by boycotting the vote, which actually helped the Soviets cover up their true intentions, with Stalin intentionally heating up the situation only to cool it off himself once the troops inevitably pulled out. However, Pishavari held out hope that this was a form of Soviet backing in the United Nations, an organization that neither republic was invited to. The other reason Pishavari may have thought he had more Soviet backing was because on the 8th, 4 days later, the Soviet Union signed a treaty of friendship with the Azerbaijan People's Government, as thousands turned out in Tabriz, forced or otherwise, to celebrate the agreement. There were natural roots to the independence movement, so not everything can assume to be propaganda, and at this point the movement was still relatively popular. However, behind Pishavari's back, the Soviets were once again negotiating with Kavam. Kavam agreed to give oil concessions to the Soviets in northern Iran in return for the Soviet withdrawal, despite the fact that the contract with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company stipulated that the oil be drawn from wells in the southern part of the country. The British were still very unhappy with the potential Soviet arrangement. However, the Americans were fine with it as it guaranteed that Soviet troops would be out of the country. The Red Army no longer fortified the whole border of the Mahabad Republic, and it subsequently entered into a military alliance with Tabriz. Iran started to move their troops to try to take advantage and push the Kurds back to Mahabad city. However, standing in their way were the Kurdish Peshmerga, made up of normally rival tribal militias in cooperation with each other, under the leadership of Qazi Muhammad, ready to fight the Iranians. On April 29th, the Iranians attacked at the Battle of Karabad. However, despite air power and superior armor, the Iranians were defeated by the Kurdish troops. To secure their position, the Kurds had to fight off further Iranian attacks over the next few days before a temporary ceasefire was signed on May 3rd. On May 8th, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution Number 5, deferring further action on the Iran crisis until the Iranians could give a report, while also maintaining the refusal to recognize or even invite the two republics. Also on May 8th, Stalin wanted to make the situation crystal clear to Pishavari, despite his previous 2 meetings with Bagirov. Stalin sent him a personal letter explaining that Soviet troops would eventually need to leave Iran, for the first time in over a year referring to the Tabriz area as part of Iran, writing to Pishavari that there was no such situation as there was in Russia during their revolutions, that he didn't doubt that the Tabrizis could win with continued Soviet support, but that Soviet support could not continue without undercutting the Soviets' image as liberators. Furthermore, Stalin added that the British and Americans had, quote, said to us, if Soviet troops can stay in Iran, then why can't British troops also stay in Syria, Egypt, Indonesia, and Greece? Or American troops stay in China, Iceland, or Denmark? Therefore, we decided to withdraw troops from Iran and Manchuria in order to unleash the liberation movement, aka communist movements, in the colonies. In other words, Stalin was actually telling Pishavari that Soviet help for his movement actually was a hindrance to it in the international arena, citing the Red Army's presence as an example of why his republic didn't receive diplomatic recognition. Stalin then added bluntly that to continue to go against the Shah's government would be to, quote, spit on everything to break with Kavam and therefore ensure a victory for the Anglophile reactionaries. Stalin, if you couldn't tell, was now very committed to his deal with Kavam and was now confident about turning the Tehran government in a pro-Soviet direction. Kavam was then invited to Moscow to meet with Molotov and other Soviet officials once again, where Molotov agreed to push Pishevari into talks with Kavam. With further Soviet pressure, the two sides negotiated and agreed to terms in principle. However, the deal was forced upon Pishevari and was half-hearted on his part, as he still wanted nothing to do with this idea. Well, if Tabriz and Pishevari were a source of annoyance to the Soviets, Mahabad was another extension of that. The Soviets, while keeping them alive by buying their entire tobacco crop, urged them to merge into the Tabriz government, while also abandoning the Red Army's direct presence in the area. For now, that didn't matter because the ceasefire agreement was still in place. However, it wasn't long before Iran took full advantage of the situation to break it, defeating the Kurds at the Battle of Mameh Shah and driving them back to the outskirts of Mahabad city. By the end of the month, the Soviets had pulled all of their troops out of Iran. At this point, both states were becoming quite unpopular, with their leaders coming to be viewed as tools of the Soviets, who weren't the most popular in the region after their starvation rations during the war, plus the fear merchants had of their communist policies. Certainly the Barzani tribe was viewed by the other Kurdish tribes as being favored by the Soviets, while in Azerbaijan, Beria's secret police was viewed as unnecessarily violent and repressive, and just an extension of the iron-fisted control exercised by Lavrenti Beria and the NKVD, infamous, of course, around the world for their terror. Molotov and Kavam continued their discussions for a pro-Soviet Tudeh government, which the Soviets felt confident was going to happen now that they had pulled troops out. In addition to just the oil concessions, the Iranian government adopted other more pro-Soviet policies, and also Kavam temporarily involved more pro-Soviet Tudeh members. The British, who had of course contested control over Iran, with the Soviets and the Russians before them for many years, now felt the country slipping away. But the Americans were not going to allow that to happen, as they encouraged the Shah and Kavam to resist Soviet pressure. The Shah explicitly agreed to hold firm. By the end of October, the Shah had broken with the pro-Soviet faction that Kavam had organized, which he had of course done at the Shah's request at that time, mind you. Kavam now called for decisive action against the Soviet client states, proposing nationwide elections including in Tabriz and Mahabad. The election law was to be enforced and implemented by the Iranian gendarme units. However, Peshawari's own units would not let the Shah's men through. The elections, scheduled for December, were fast approaching, and now Kavam did side with the Shah, advising the Americans that he would break with the pro-Soviet faction he had organized, and that his Iranian Democratic Party would support the invasion of Tabriz as soon as possible. On December 4th, the Iranian offensive began. By the 10th, they had made significant progress, however, horror stories followed in their wake. The American judge, William O. Douglas, later wrote about the Iranian offensive, writing that following the capture of territory, speaking or writing in the Azerbaijani language was banned. The beards of traditional peasants would be burned off. Some peasants were outright murdered, their wives and daughters were often raped, some houses were plundered and burned, and numerous livestock were stolen, both systematically and by individual gendarme units. With his state collapsing around him, Peshavari was pressured by the Soviets to follow the previous agreement he had made with Kavam, while venting that the agreement brought to mind the Gilan events of 1920. Remember, Peshavari had worked in the administration of the then Persian Soviet Republic. Peshavari continued, "Our revolutionary comrades were deceived by the Soviets, and reactionaries were allowed to gradually launch repressions against them. Many of them had to emigrate. History will repeat itself." Peshavari was in effect drawing a direct parallel between the Soviet abandonment of their Rasht allies in 1921 with their abandonment of their Tabriz allies here in 1946. And Peshavari, being in both governments, did indeed see history repeat itself. The Shah's forces made significant inroads on the 11th, and on that day, amidst the chaos, Peshavari received a second personal letter from Stalin. Stalin, hearing about Peshavari's complaints, was much more direct this time about the Soviets' position. The Man of Steel told Peshawari that as Prime Minister of Iran, Qavam had the right to send troops to any part of the country, Azerbaijan being no exception. This statement right here is essentially telling Peshawari that Stalin no longer viewed the Tabriz area as anything other than part of Iran. This was, of course, a betrayal and a straight-up about-face, but it's not as if Peshawari wasn't given any advance warning. In case his point wasn't quite clear, Stalin added that continued armed resistance would be useless, pointless, and unprofitable. And he told Peshawari straight up, announced that you have nothing against the presence of governmental troops, and that you'll accept and participate in the call for elections. And to say that you're doing it, quote, for the unity of the Iranian people. Now, referring to the Azeri separatists as the Iranian people very much signaled the end of any Soviet support. Seeing the writing on the wall, Peshawari resigned, and along with most of his cabinet and his party, fled to the Soviet Union. Despite being allowed into the Soviet Union, Peshawari did die less than a year later in a car accident while living in Baku. However, no connections to the NKVD, to the Iranian Secret Service, or to any other intelligence service has ever been made. At Bagirov's request, the Soviets opened the border and allowed Azeri refugees fleeing the Iranian army to start streaming in. Hundreds of Azeris per day crossed over and resettled in the Soviet Union, especially those from Tabriz. The next day, the Shah's troops captured the city, and continuing their harsh reprisals, approximately 421 Azeris died, most of them civilians. Meanwhile, cynical as they were, the Soviet Union didn't really care that civilians were dying in Tabriz, mainly due to their use of the Azeri people like pawns. What the Soviets were focused on at this time was securing that oil concession, and as soon as they heard that the Shah's troops had recaptured Tabriz, the Soviets started applying pressure that the Iranian government should obey and ensure the execution of the April 4th oil agreement. When they received no reply, the Soviet ministers in Moscow began getting nervous. Meanwhile, the Shah's troops had moved south and were now closing in on Mahabad. On December 15th, they captured the Kurdish stronghold. The teaching of the Kurdish language was banned, and the Iranians even had a book burning for Kurdish language literature. Qazi Muhammad had not fled to the Soviet Union and instead was captured and imprisoned by the Iranian gendarme. The same day, in Tehran, the Shah's parade force was holding a commemoration ceremony for the victory in Tabriz and the reincorporation of the city into Iran. By December 19th, the situation in both republics was desperate. The final refugees were making their way into the Soviet Union, approximately 5,800 Azeris, Kurds, and other minorities having fled since December 12th. The next day, the Iranians finally captured all of the territory and immediately began holding military tribunals for officers and officials of the former republics, most of whom were tortured and/or executed. At the same time, Qavam, under British and American pressure, stalled in his commitment to the Soviet oil deal, finally replying to the Kremlin saying he would set up the treaty once all the necessary conditions were met. However, he sent this on the day that it appeared the necessary conditions were met, that being Iran's recovery of its pre-war territory. The Soviets were left baffled and wondering what the necessary conditions were, as many began to suspect that British and American pressure was going to prevent the concession from happening after all. Those weren't the only promises that the Shah was backing off. On December 31st, the day the elections were finally going to be held, the Shah backed off his promises for electoral reforms and for Tabrizi autonomy. The elections, which many suspected were rigged, were dominated by pro-British candidates, throwing the Soviet oil deal further into doubt. On March 20th, the Barzani Kurds clashed with the Shah's troops outside Nablus. Despite the loss of their state, the Kurds were going to keep on fighting, especially the Barzani tribe, Barzan being a cross-border region between Iran and Iraq. The Kurds took an Iranian general's son hostage, which kept the militants safe as it prevented air raids, with Iran trying to avoid any harm to the general's son. This was also an area in which the Kurds were at a big disadvantage, so it worked two ways. On March 30th, the former leader of the Kurdish People's Government, Qazi Muhammad, was tried, along with his brother. American diplomat and intelligence officer Archie Roosevelt Jr. had American ambassador to Iran, George Allen, urgently request that the Shah not execute Qazi or his brother, excusing their collaboration with the Soviets as simple political expediency. The Shah told Allen, quote, "Are you afraid I'm going to have them shot? If so, you can rest your mind, I am not." Technically true to his word, the next day the Shah had the two publicly hanged in Mahabad. This prompted Kurdish outrage, and it also prompted Roosevelt Jr. to remark that the Shah had likely ordered the brothers' execution, quote, as soon as our ambassador had closed the door behind him, and adding that he wasn't one of the Shah's personal fans. Despite the relative success, at this point the Kurds were simply guerrilla fighters, and seeing the handwriting on the wall, they attempted to smuggle their weaponry into Iraq. But after clashing with the pro-British Iraqi authorities, they re-engaged the Iranians who they knew would give them trouble. Yet they had to pass through Iranian territory to get to the Soviet Union, who had offered them asylum. The Kurds had to fight their way past Iranian troops, sometimes keeping them away by ambushing their supply columns. On June 18th, the long journey was finally over, and the Barzani Kurds reached the River Aras, crossing into the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, by August 1st, the elections process had been finalized. Kavam's moderates were held down, but his pro-British candidates won a majority, with the legitimacy of this election again thrown somewhat into question. However, Kavam's pro-British candidates were even less likely than his moderates to approve the Soviet oil concession, and the deal was officially cancelled by the end of August. Stalin was absolutely furious, but there was nothing he could do as his troops were already out of the country. Plus, the Americans and the British had diplomatic mastery over Iran, making a pro-Soviet coup in the country nearly impossible to pull off. Meanwhile, in Tehran, the opposition to Kavam was happy about rejecting the Soviet oil deal, but they were enraged at the Shah and Kavam for breaking their election reform promises. A series of protest movements over these issues began. The name of the man leading the opposition? Mohammad Mossadegh. And this is, of course, the part where the story becomes well told and well known. But hopefully this adds a little bit of background for the next time you hear the Mossadegh story. And hopefully this provides a little bit of context for the next time you hear about Berlin or Korea and the start of the Cold War. So thank you for watching, especially if you watched it all the way through. I hope it was informative, entertaining, and most of all, I hope you learned something.